Net zero is a term that we've heard so many times on the media about countries, companies, people going net zero. What does it mean? How do you get there? This video is designed to get you to net zero in 5 simple steps. It's designed for businesses of medium and large size. I'm not saying some of the sort of principles I'm about to go through won't apply if you're either a small company or an individual, but really this is aimed at companies with in excess of 50 staff and specific sweet spot, the people we deal with, companies over 250 staff. 250, what's the largest we've got? Probably around about 6,000 or 7,000. So that's the sweet spot. That's what we're trying to do. Let's go through it. Okay, so what are the 5 steps to get you to net zero? Let's have a look. Number 1, planning. By this I kind of mean strategic planning. How are you going to go about it, resources, timescales, etc. And I'll go into all of these in a little bit more detail after I just put the list up. Number 2, once you've got a plan, you can look at the scope. What are you going to include in your net zero calculation and what are you going to exclude? Maybe bringing things in later. So a good scoping exercise. Number 3, let's have a look at number 3, the initial footprint. Okay, initial footprint. The initial footprint is, there we go. The initial footprint is when the first time you press the button and the software spits out, what your carbon footprint is. That's quite exciting for a lot of people because they don't know how big it is at all. And the first time they say, for example, it's 7,000 tons or 4,000 tons, or one of my clients, 6.9 million tons. That's quite an exciting time. Okay, after you've got the initial footprint, we've got to look at projecting forwards. So here we're looking at what we're going to do to reduce the carbon footprint. It's not all about measuring it, it's about lowering it down, sort of reducing your carbon use. That's the point of the whole purpose. So very important step there. And number 5, you're into then the communication. Communication and dissemination, etc. You're all about sort of having a look at telling people in your organization, look, this is what we've got, this is our plan, this is our initial footprint, it needs a lot of work, but this is where we're going. So that whole communication piece at the end, and of course you then loop back once you've got that back up to the initial footprint, and by then of course it will be multiple footprint runs, not just initial anymore, and you keep working around this sort of loop at the end. So there you go, they're the 5 stages. Let's have a look at them in a little more detail. Okay, so the first step is planning. So let's put down what we need to put into our plan. And here I'm talking more about a strategic plan of how you're going to run this activity. If it's going to go over 2 or 3 years, then you need some clear ideas about who's going to be doing what, when. Not many things in it, but they're important. So let's run through them. First one, I'll go through clockwise. First one, carbon policy. This is a short statement. I've seen them half a page long. I've seen them 2 pages long. I prefer them short. Half a page is perfectly good enough. And it's what you're trying to do as a business. It will say, for example, that we intend to become carbon neutral by 2030. That's very popular. I see that a lot. I've seen a couple saying we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050. That's so far in the future. It's not very valuable as far as I'm concerned. Another thing to include in your carbon policy could be something like, we intend to reduce our carbon emissions by X% every year, year on year. Now, a figure that I'm seeing pushed around a lot at the moment, especially with the excellent work the United Nations are doing on this, on their UN Global Compact, which I think Anistic are actually going to join that. I'm so impressed by it. It's good. I like it. They're putting 2.5% figures in. Science-based target, I think, uses 2.5 as well. And so you might have a carbon policy that says we will be carbon neutral by 2030, and we will look to reduce our carbon use by 2.5% year on year for example, the next 10 years or something like that. That's very typical policy, and what it means is when you get to the end here and you've got a system in place, you can see whether it met the objectives that you set out in the first place. So there you go, carbon policy. What else? Team. Who's going to be doing it? Now, if you've got a large organization, there's a trick here. There's both a pitfall and a trick. The pitfall is don't end up doing it all yourself. You know, I deal with a number of people where the board has said, I tell you what, would you mind awfully just doing the carbon net zero piece? And, you know, you end up scurrying around the organization, gathering data left, right, and center, and it's a lot of work. The trick here with a team is to try and look at your organization and see who can work with you to put data in for their element. So, for example, their site or their class of asset, you know, for example, if it's a travel manager or stuff like that. So if you can, you're the central hub, you pull it all together, but you've got people in every site or in every building or whatever it is to help you and push data to you. And if you've got the right software, I'll come on to that in a second, then you know you can enable the software so that they can type their own data in. That will cut down your work significantly, believe me, okay? The other thing that you can bring in here are green champions. So I've seen those work very well in a number of organizations, and I strongly recommend it. You know, there are people in your organization who care a lot about the environment. They're quite passionate about the whole thing, which is good. You know, it's more power to their pen. And if you can include them in the process, they both feel like they've got a voice and input into the process, so they take more ownership of the whole thing. And second is, you know, these people generally are very useful to spread the word, come up with ideas, get things done. So green champions, great thing to pull into the team here. Resources, I think, you know, when it's all said and done, I think with this one, I really talk about money. You know, how much money have you got to do this? Is it done on a shoestring, in which case you'll get result A? Is it extremely well funded? You'll get result B and somewhere in between. You've got two sort of thing with resources. The first is, have you got enough resource allocated or enough money available to actually come up with the net zero plan? And secondly, if the net zero plan says, look, I'm terribly sorry, but you know that boiler over there is just old, it needs replacing, have you got enough money to actually do the projects that you're going to be proposing? Probably, you know, down at this stage, stage 4. Okay, what else? Time. What is the time frame that you're looking at? Typical time frames that I see with my clients, specifically, you know, 250 staff or more, that sort of size of client, is around about 6 months to 12 months for the initial carbon footprint calc, to collect all the data in. There's a lot, input it all into PLATO, the software that we use, and then get just to the point where you've got the initial footprint. It's more work than you think. If you've got a dedicated team, maybe it's faster, but my recommendation there is look at a 3-year program where you can bring some things into your footprint calculation in year 1, some things in year 2, some things in year 3, and I'll go on to more about that. I'm going to speak more about that when I talk about the scope. But a 36-month time frame with a 6 to 12 month time frame to get the initial footprint is about right. Okay. Finally, what software you're going to use. You know, larger companies we come across are using, you know, Oracle's environmental sort of analysis program. Some people are using the SAP, and they tend to be the sort of, you know, the FTSE 50 companies and that sort of thing. If you're not a FTSE 50 company and you want software to process it all for you, then again, you know, our software that we produce called PLATO is a very good sort of cost-effective alternative to the, you know, Oracle and SAP. If you are FTSE 50, you're probably better off going with those first two solutions. But if you've got, for example, over 250 staff or over 50 staff, that's the kind of the bottom end of our range, 50 staff and above, then PLATO is a good cost-effective route to gather all this data and do your footprinting in here. Okay, so that's the plan. It doesn't take long to devise it, but there's normally a bit of sort of politics to go on there just to see who's got what money, what team, and over what period of time it's going to go on. All right, so that's the plan. That's step one. Let's have a look at step two, which is scoping. Okay, so you've got a plan, step one. Step two, let's define the scope of the project, okay? Now, why is that important? All carbon's split into three sort of categories: scope one, scope two, scope three. Scope one, to simplify it all down, is generally gas and fuel. Scope two is generally electricity, and scope three is where everything else sits. And there are 15 subcategories of scope three carbon emissions. And some of them are easy, some of them are hard to calculate. Some of them are easy to get the data for, some of them are hard to get the data for. So it's a toss-up between which scope threes you choose to include, or if you're following a standard up here, which ones you are mandated to use. So I've listed up 6 standards that are very popular at the moment, and you can look at which one you're looking to use for your project. ESOS, broadly speaking, is scope 1, scope 2. They're just bringing in some scope 3s now. SECR, same deal. Scope 1, yes. Scope 2, yes. Some scope 3s are being added to the standard in 2022. B Corp, quite a lot of work there. In my opinion, has a bit of an American tendency, an American feel to it, but it's a good standard, comprehensive, a lot of work. My client's doing B Corp. There's a lot of work there. SBT, to be brutally honest, everything we do at Anistic here with all of our clients is science-based targets. So we've been doing that now for many years, and that's what our software, which I suppose I'll come on to in a second, PLATO, it's all built around SBT. And if you haven't got a solid core of data analysis and calculation engines running in the center that look at percentage increases and absolute increases, then you're probably not going to get this right. You're going to need it. It's not good enough to say we are going to be green. You need numbers, you need locations, you need targets, you need progress against targets, all those sort of things that are built into SBT and indeed built into PLATO, the system we run. PPN is pretty new, specifically PPN 0621, the new policy procedure from the UK government. I quite like what they say. They say scope 1, scope 2, and in scope 3, there's only 5 of them that they put in. The first is, the upstream travel. How much carbon do you use getting stuff to you? The second one is downstream carbon generation, i.e. if you've got trucks delivering your product, what they use. The next one is business travel, including flights and taxis, trains, stuff like that. Then you've got commuting and how much carbon is generated with your staff getting to their place of work, and finally waste. So I quite like, I might even give that an underline in red, those 5 are a good starting point if you don't know what to do, all right? If you want to expand it out a bit later with some of the UN Global Compact stuff, and I like the UN Global Compact, I think that's the one that we're going to follow internally in Anistic. It's a good standard. But if you're going to be looking at which ones to use, those 5, upstream, downstream, travel, waste, commuting, are a good starting point. Ones you can bring in later if you want to, the trickier ones, but very important, supply chain processing. Yeah, and down here where I've put the time element of a footprint, you might say, well, in year 1, we're going to do the basic 5. Yeah. And in year 2, we're going to start bringing in supply chain. And then in year 3, we'll start looking at our building stock, actually when we make new buildings and asset purchases, so buying new company cars and things like that, and look at our investment portfolio. And you can easily see how for, a certain size of company, those tasks will easily be a lot of work for a group of people over 36 months. There's a lot of work in there. Okay, so time element of footprint development, what you're going to do in year 1, year 2, year 3, etc. Okay, Frequency, you'll end up with a footprint, but it will very soon become out of date. How often are you going to refresh that? Is it going to be annual? I would say that's probably the worst you could probably get. Quarterly is very popular with my clients, some of them that go for quarterly. Monthly, I've got one client that wants to do monthly, but in fairness is not really working that well. It's too frequent. The data comes in from the various data sources slower than that, so it was always a bit wrong, really. If you have to choose a frequency, either twice a year, annual, or quarterly is a good choice. Quarterly is probably one that works really quite well. Then you've got in your scope, what do you put in it? You've already decided what scope 3 elements to put in, sort of obviously the standard influences that. But what assets are you going to put in? Which sites? Which countries? So for example, are you going to include leased cars? Are you going to include leased plant if you've got a construction company? If you're multinational, are you going to include your overseas sort of operations? So that's, there's a lot that you can do in there. There's a lot of mistakes you can make, and I'll do another sort of podcast on that for you, just so you can go into a little bit more deep dive on how to draw a line around the components within the plan. Last one up the top here is which software. It's these days, if you're doing scope 3 calculations, it is just too complex to do it with a pencil and paper. You can put it on a spreadsheet, but it's just a nightmare. In the same way that you wouldn't really go about doing a set of company accounts on Excel, you wouldn't really go about doing a decent footprint calculation without some software to kind of, do the grunt work for you, really. And with software, of course, allow remote data entry, so that you're not doing it all yourself. You're getting your team to sort of help you out. Three that I see, you've got Oracle, SAP at the top. Generally, as I said earlier, I think aiming at the FTSE 50, maybe the FTSE 100 companies. Underneath that, you've got PLATO, and that's the software we develop, and is aimed really at a cost-effective way of getting to your footprint and allowing a global operation to be entering their carbon data into the system. Okay, that's scoping. It normally ends up, our scoping documents tend to be around about, 12, 15 pages long when we do them, when we print them off. They're all online, of course, but when we print them, 12, 15 pages. Biggest area you're going to have problems with is this area here. What sites, assets and countries, and which are the scope 3s to put in. They're the two problematic areas in all of this. There you go. That's scoping. That's step 2. Let's look at step 3. Okay, we've got a plan like that. We've defined the scope of the project, critical to get that component right. Let's talk about the initial footprint. What is your initial carbon footprint? I'll work my way around, as usual. Start with time frame. In the scoping period, scoping document rather, you should have actually said, well, we're going to base our first carbon footprint here, for example, on last calendar year, or on the last 12 months, or on the last financial year. They're very sort of common periods to choose. It's almost always 12 months. I wouldn't bother doing anything else apart from 12 months, unless you've got the resources to sort of do that. You set your time frame, and then it's all about data collection. What you can do is you can sit yourself down with a strong cup of coffee and work out what data you're going to need for this process. If you remember backing the scoping exercise, step 2, you define which of the scope 3 categories you're going to include, and if you know those, you're going to need to know what data you're going to require, and just make a list of it. Who is going to supply that data? And as I said, right in step 1, when you're talking about the plan here, my tip is that you get as many people as possible to feed data into the system, not you. Who supplies it? How often is it going to be supplied? A problem that we see very often at the moment is electricity companies giving bills either quarterly or in one case annually. And so actually maintaining something any faster than that is difficult. And sometimes when you say, what's the carbon footprint from the past 12 months? You can say, well, actually, we haven't got that bill, we haven't got that bill, I haven't got that bill, etc. And down here, how accurate is it? So there's something built into most of the software platforms, it's certainly in PLATO, that you can actually say, what's the data quality of this data feed like? You could say, for example, it is it's based on some sort of surrogate figure. So for example, we don't measure that, but we measure that so we can work that out. I'll give you an example, taxes. You might not know how many miles you travel in a London cab, but you know how much money you spent, and you can say it's kind of proportional one to the other, etc. So, but how accurate is that? If you classed it A being, penny perfect, right down to E being not good and F not usable, then that sort of thing is typically about a C, quality C. Getting data here is a lot of work. I mean, people aren't used to it. What we see with a lot of companies, you go to them and say, we require this, 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 and everybody kind of just brushes it aside and gets on with whatever they were doing. That's going to change as more emphasis is put on net zero projects, but it is an issue. And you will end up with, I'll put it down there, I'm going to underline it in red because it's happens so often. Gap analysis. You will have big gaps in your data, unfortunately. And the target, I suspect, is that this year the gaps you've got are this number. Next year, not as many gaps. Year after that, even fewer gaps. It's just people don't collect the data, or it's not available, not recorded in the right format. As I say, in many cases, it's just actually getting it sent to you or getting it remote data entered in the first place. Organizational challenges rather than actual sort of data processing challenges. So, as you're doing the footprint, maintain a gap analysis, maintain here an accuracy register so that you know really how good the data is you're dealing with. And up here, you'll end up doing a lot of estimating. You always do. And as I say, hopefully over the years, as people get used to the process of sort of supplying data into this sort of net zero system, the number of estimates you're going to have to make will go down. But there are a fair few. ESOS will allow you to estimate 10% of the data. It says for 90% of it, you should have that sort of penny perfect. That's for scope 1 and scope 2. They haven't defined scope 3 yet. For SECR, same deal. For scope 1 and scope 2, you need it to be 97% accurate, and you're allowed to sort of estimate sort of 2% or up to 3% at a push. But you ended up with a lot of estimating going on. Everybody does. And there's a catch here. You've got to be careful when you've done all this work, you press the button and, bang, your carbon footprint is such and such. You've got to be careful that you always qualify that when you're reporting it with what you're actually reporting. It would be just a chronic mistake to say our footprint is, for example, 1,712 tons of CO2. Yeah, a better way, a way that really you should be thinking of is saying, well, with this included, and with quality of data being a C, our carbon footprint is looking like it's in the region of 1,700, whatever it's going to be. Stress to the people you're telling that the story is not finished, that there are some scope 3s you've not included. The story is not finished because a lot of data is at quality levels C, D, and E, and therefore the number is going to be very inaccurate, reasonably inaccurate. So it gives you a good idea of what your footprint is, but just be careful. It's very easy to say our footprint's 1,000. It's not. Assuming this, and this, it's that. But if you take those assumptions away, you get a different answer. I'll give you an example. One of my clients has a footprint of around about 2,000 or so tons of CO2. Then they did, in the next sort of phase of the work we did with them, we included their supply chain data. And it went from 2 up to 18. So 2,000 up to 18,000. It's massive, And if you go out there and just shout to the world, say our carbon footprint is 2, it's not correct. The footprint is nearer 18, it's probably more than that. not 2. So just be careful of that there. But having said all that, when you see your initial footprint, it is very interesting because you can actually start seeing for the first time, bam, this is roughly what we're talking about with these assumptions. And, you can start seeing how good or how bad you are. So it is an exciting time getting to your footprint. So there you go, that's stage 3. Let's next talk about step 4, which is projecting forwards. Okay, so now step 4, the important step. This is critical. You've got now a plan in place. You've got a scope, so you know what's in and out, and over time, what's going to be in and out of the scope of your project. You've got your initial footprint with all the fun and games that go into collecting data and trying to pull everything together into an initial figure with some assumptions, as I said earlier, with some assumptions about what the footprint includes and doesn't include. But now, with step 4, we've got to decide what to do about it. It's the name of the game here is reducing your carbon footprint, not just telling people what it is. So what we're doing here is we're projecting forward a number of projects that we can come up with that are going to lower the carbon use. Okay, how are you going to come up with the project? Well, some are common sense. It's for example, LED lighting these days is a common sense one. The other one we see a lot at the moment is, as the pandemic is starting to ease, people are looking to carry on doing Teams and Zoom. So the business travel element is going down a lot. So some are obvious. Others you might need to do audits for, either energy audits or carbon audits, depending on what you want to do. Where typically, for a big site, typically we spend a day going around looking at all the big equipment, figuring out what can be done to reduce energy down on that particular site. You should be quantifying what the projects are going to save, and that is difficult. It's obviously you'd spend longer quantifying a project that's got a higher cost to it than a smaller cost, but you should have a go really, so that you know what the effect of the carbon reduction is going to be. What you can then do, once you've done all this, is you can skip around to my doodle here. And I'm not the best doodler in the world, so my apologies for the quality of my doodles, but you can skip over to this one and just pop them into some sort of matrix here, where you're looking at high cost projects or high impact projects, ones that deliver the most carbon saving. And what you're obviously looking to do is you're looking to stage your budget to implement these by looking at the ones that deliver the best savings at the lowest cost. I mean, it's quite obvious really, isn't it? So if you judge every project over there, when you quantify it into saving and cost, you can then use this grid to drive your budget. Once you've got that, once you know roughly what projects you're going to do with the budget, and you know what budget you've got allocated in the first place, it goes back to this planning stage here, what is going to get signed off and what's just going to get shelved, you can then start looking at plotting it forwards into some sort of waterfall diagram, where on the left-hand side you put what your carbon use is now, then you sort of schedule in when the projects are going to cut in, which will reduce it down, reduce it down, reduce it down, until eventually in 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, you can see what the carbon's likely to be at the end of that process. Okay? Then what? Well, every company, without exception, is going to end up with some carbon being emitted from what they do, from their activities, okay? And what you're going to be looking at there is some form of offsetting. So, once you know the sort of the end of this this end figure here, so say for example you've got a figure here of say 2,000 tons CO2e, you've got 2,000 tons there, you know that you're looking to offset that amount down there. Now, when you come to offsetting, there are a number of pitfalls to watch out for. The first is there are a lot of people out there who are less than sort of straight in terms of unscrupulous sort of traders out there, And I've certainly heard stories of people planting trees and then selling the savings as an offsetting scheme, the same trees, to multiple people. So you've got to watch out for that. Also, just be aware of the additionality with offsetting. So India's just been through a program where they planted 1 billion trees. They were going to do that anyway, whether or not you contribute a figure, financial amount into that project or not by way of an offsetting payment. They were still going to do it. So what's the point? What are you doing? You're not really saving carbon, are you? You might be in some sort of roundabout way. But have a look to make sure that the money that you put into something actually goes to save carbon. It's obvious really. When you look at it in a bit more detail, there's a couple of standards out there. We use the gold standard, where they check these things for you, and then you can just buy into the offsetting. And if you need any more information on that, just let me know, and I can certainly sort of help you through it. And there's a couple of sort of offsetting schemes that we like. The other thing that you can do with offsetting, when we start talking about the step 5, the communication piece, is the offsetting projects that are out there. So for example, either tree planting, reforestation, or for example, one of the ones I like is actually providing solar cookers down to Central Africa. So they don't burn wood, they use the sun. When you look at those, they often have very emotive images. And when you're looking at communicating out to the rest of the organization, if you, for example, narrowed your offsetting sort of options down into 3 groups and then gave those to people and said, look, which one do you prefer out of these? You can actually get them engaged in the process, hopefully with your green champions in there as well, but you can get them engaged and you can actually, sort of show them the work you're doing. And whilst they're looking at the pictures to do with the offsetting and deciding which one to vote for, you can actually start introducing them to the concept of this is what our footprint is with these assumptions, and this is what we're looking to do about it. So you can use offsetting to great effect in communication, and no matter what you do, you're going to need some form of offsetting for the carbon that you're going to end up with after you do all these projects. So the last thing to mention when you are projecting forward is don't forget to track it. You are going to end up with a target here, say for example 2030, where you're looking to say, well, in 2030 we want to be carbon neutral, and we're here. At the moment it's 2021, tail end of 2021. You're looking to go down to there. Where are you on that journey? Are you heading in the right direction? Are you going to be meeting your objectives? And if you remember, the objectives are what we set in the carbon policy back in step 1. So there you go. Projecting forwards, very important. It's what it's about. It's not about what the footprint is, it's about what you do about it. That's step 4. Step 5, let's have a look at communicating success, maintaining the system. Okay, the 5th and final step, let's have a look. We've made a plan, we've had a scoping exercise, we've done our initial footprint, we've projected forwards where that footprint's going to go. Now we're on to that last stage, and it's a set of 4 things. I couldn't really think of a natty title to tie it all together, but it's kind of the loop, the end loop of the process. And it's made up of 4 parts: publish, communicate, maintain, and track. Okay, so, in order, publish your carbon footprint, write it down, saying that from what we know at the moment, a snapshot in time, this is our carbon footprint. This is what's included, this is what's excluded, this is the further work we've got to do on the whole project to get the figure more accurate and to include more data, fill in the gaps, etc. Publish it down. You might also need to publish it for legal reasons, if you're doing some form of project, for example, ESOS or SECR, you're going to need to publish anyway. So let's publish it and then communicate through. Communicate success, I think I missed the word out there really. So communicate success. You've done a lot of work on this and you've got a good plan and you've got buy-in from senior management. Go out and shout about it. The world's in a pretty tricky place at the moment. We need people to go out there and say, look, we care, we're doing something. We've got a thought through plan. Shout it from the rooftops, tell your shareholders, tell your suppliers, tell your customers, make sure the board are fully aware that all the money they've put into this, they're getting something back from it. It's a great message to sort of push forward, especially if you remember back on those offsetting sort of choices. They're really good sort of imagery that you can put in the communication pieces. Maintain. Well, the bad news is, of course, that once you've done your carbon footprint once, you've just got to do it again. Some legislation requires it's an annual process. Some people do it quarterly. Some of my clients do it monthly, but whatever it is, whatever you decided back in the planning and scoping exercise, you are going to need to revisit this, go back, have another look at the footprint, maybe still make sure your scope is relevant, but have another look at the footprint and you can just maintain that as you go through. And the last one, obviously linked to that, is track it against your goals. Back here, do you remember the first thing we did was set a carbon policy? So we want to be carbon neutral by such and such. So so using my new markers, very, very pleased with these, what the goal will be. Obviously, that if it's carbon neutral and net zero, you know that you're going to be there. How are you on that journey? How are you getting on? Is your clever planning and all the hard work people are doing, is that having an effect? Are you reducing it down? Okay, so certify. I've written it kind of up there. You can if you want. It depends on whether you've used external software. If you've done it yourself, then you might want to sort of get someone to look over it just to make sure your calcs are correct. But that last stage, publish, maintain, communicate success and track, those components there, very important, especially the communicate success. Otherwise, the last thing you want is this put in a drawer and never looked at. You want it to be used and you want the project to be useful. Okay, so there you go. 5 simple steps to get to net zero. I've gone through them one by one for you. Hopefully you've picked up on the fact that you need to set a good objective. Why are you doing it? How are you going to do it? Scope, what are you going to count in and count out? Who's going to help you and who's going to start feeding you sort of data, etc., etc. Initial footprint, well, we know the first time you do it, it's going to be, how shall we say, got a few gaps, areas of improvement in, but that's going to get better over time. It can only get better over time. Do the gap analysis, have a look at where you have to estimate data. Next time you do it, try and work on those areas to improve. Project forwards, we've seen there that it's not about finding out what your footprint is, it's about doing something about it. And it's absolutely critical that you put in some decent carbon reduction projects just to reduce your footprint down in line with the initial policy that you set up here. And of course, the last stage down here, communicate. So, shout it to the rooftops, what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the successes you've had, maybe even some of the challenges you're coming across, and get people to buy into the process. You are going to have to repeat it, as I say, at least every year, if not more frequently. And this whole cycle then sort of spins around there. So there you go, net zero in 5 simple steps. If you want help with this, let us know. We're here to help. We know this stuff. Specifically, if you want to automate and take the drudgery out of a lot of the data collection, data processing part, and having everything in one place is just a brilliant idea. That's our software, PLATO, and if you're interested in PLATO, I put the communication link in the video, underneath the video notes, and you can just have a look at PLATO, see if it sort of suits you and suits what you're trying to do. From experience, 100% guaranteed, it makes a lot of things much easier. I mean, so many things much easier. And the same way that you wouldn't look to do your accounts, and the same sort of flow there with an accounting system, you wouldn't look to do your accounts on a piece of paper. Whatever you're doing, make sure you're using a software package at least, otherwise you just go drown in calculations. All right, there you go. Hope that was useful. If you want to check out the other videos we've done on carbon neutrality and net zero, then I'll try and put the links to those below as well.